Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending your Friday evening with us. I'm Meryl from National Gallery Singapore. In March earlier this year, the gallery opened its doors to the exhibition Latif Muhyiddin Pago Pago. The exhibition had traveled across oceans to the Pompidou and Ilham Gallery in KL, and it was finally coming back to the gallery. We were all looking forward to its homecoming. Unfortunately, the long-awaited opening was tragically timed. A week after the doors to the exhibition opened, doors everywhere else closed. Singapore had entered the unprecedented circuit breaker period. Amongst many of the artworks that audiences could no longer see, the gallery had actually invited Pak Latif to create a map of Kampong Glam in the 1960s as he remembered it. In this time when going to the hawker centres was a rushed affair, where we were confined to the four walls and the edges of our screens, where the thought of traversing a physical space was unthinkable, Pak Latif's map transported us to a place where sights, sounds, and smells were especially poignant. In the map, Pak Latif describes the colourful booksellers who carried the latest books from the Malay world to the fantastic ketoprak and wayang orang theatre performances that he watched into the wee hours as a little boy. He recounts the elderly man who would stand on a short bamboo stool, telling stories of heroes and villains in different voices and with animated hand gestures and body movements. We knew we wanted to work with the map to bring it to life. And so, inspired by the soundscape of Kampong Glam, the gallery invited artists Bani Haykal and Ong Kian Peng to think about how public space could be reimagined in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so they created an immersive world that layered sounds from Kampong Glam today, a speculative text on the Kampong Tenggelam community with their absent presence palpable as we navigate through the zones, as you had seen earlier, with visuals captured from a 360-degree camera. This evening, we're very pleased to have Bani and Bin here to share with us a bit more about the processes of making the work. They will also later share about their own artistic practice, and we will have a short Q&A after the session. So please post your questions on Facebook, and we'll take them after the presentations. So for a start, I would like to invite Bani and Bin, just to share two questions first on the work. So Bani and Bin. Hi Bani, hi Bin.
Hello.
Hello.
How are
Yeah,
you?
so I thought we could just, start with just speaking a little bit more about the work Kampung Tenggelam and the process of making it. So we invited the
Yeah.
both of you to create this work based on the map that Latif had drawn. How do you decide to work with this initial stimulus? And if you could also take us through the process of collaborating on this project.
So yeah, maybe I'll take. I'll have a go at this first. Yeah, hello. Thank you for being here. So when I was first approached to do this work, aside from seeing a hand drawn map, right, which is something that I can't say that I come across every day. One thing that I sort of like related it back to was this idea of trying to recall something and basically having to imprint it onto something for others to look at or to share with others as well. And I think that was sort of like the starting point for me to think about what it meant to share this idea of a memory from so long ago, something which is very distant from myself. That period is absolutely foreign to me. And so in thinking through that, I was sort of like wanting to, at the interest of not wanting to just come up with a new work, I was also trying to find ways to attach it back to my own sort of like not just my practice but my own interest in this idea of what it means to examine a map or to inhabit a map in general. And from that point on, it dawned on me to sort of like bring in this ongoing work that I've had going on for quite some time, called Isolated Futures, which is a series of speculative fiction work that imagines communities surviving really challenging or troubling times by creating or piecing together new kinds of technological innovations, which centers or focus more on what it means to survive as a community. And so that was pretty much the first thing that struck me in terms of connecting these two elements together: Pak Latif's work, the map, and also where I sort of like see myself as an artist responding to these elements. That aside, I knew that, you know, it would be quite an opportunity to be able to work with Kian Peng, with Bin, someone whom, you know, we've shared certain exhibition spaces together before, but we've never really had that opportunity to sort of like work together or interact together. And so I approached him and said, you know, I've got some general basic ideas and concepts that I wanted to deal with. Um, how would he sort of like take this, and what would he then sort of like return back in terms of his personal creative or artistic output and input? So maybe Bin could share a little bit more from this point on.
Yeah. So when Bani approached, so Bani actually invited me to work on this together, and my immediate response was like, okay, Bani, of course, let's do it. But then I saw the map, and I've always had a fascination with maps, and this goes way back when I was young, and I really loved, you know, reading the atlas and playing games that sort of allowed me to navigate through the world. And some of these games were based on real maps, and so there was always this correlation between the virtual and the physical world. So it was interesting for me to see how this project could pan out. Especially, it's kind of a place where we are familiar with, but at the same time, not so familiar with. Like, I used to have a studio space in Haji Lane, on the second floor, but I've never really explored the place as much as I should, because I was just hiding there and like doing my own stuff. So I thought it was a great chance for me to get to know the place better. And this project sort of offered me this opportunity to go deeper into that, especially with input from Bani, like, you know, he would share like some of this research that he was already working on. So we started on this actually before the circuit breaker period, and initially I didn't really know what I wanted to make out of this map. You know, I had all these stories and research, and there were certain, you know, points that I was especially interested in, like, you know, the area being so close to the sea, for example, and some of these sites that were no longer there. But visually, I was still kind of a bit lost. And so I mean, I just went out to begin taking footages and collecting materials first, and then just sort of throwing myself out there, not really knowing what to do, and also feeding into this idea of wandering, and allowing me myself to get lost and to experience the space. And I think that became something recurring throughout this project, also in the final outcome as well. Yeah. Do we say more?
So clearly, we are inexperienced. I guess this probably would be a good time to go into sort of like our respective presentations. Sort of like personal practices in relation to Kampong Tenggelam, but also to sort of like dig a little bit deeper into what sort of like services these works, or what informs the works. But yes, before that, okay, so clearly I have written a script which has been derailed a little bit, but no matter, we'll still keep to this. So yes, of course, thank you so much, Meryl, for the introduction, and also to the curators who gave us this opportunity to respond to Pak Latif's map. So very big thank you to Mustafa, Tamaris, and Erica for the conversations and patience leading to the launch of this work. Yes, of course, it goes without saying that I would like to thank Bin as well, my collaborator, and he'll be presenting right after me. And again, it was a really good opportunity to have had this chance to work together with him, and I'm very much glad and happy that he said yes. Thank you. So for my talk, I've given it the title "Cryptocartography: Maps for a Polyphonic Future." And allow me very briefly to preface my talk by expanding a little on what the title sort of like means. Right. So for quite some time, I have been thinking about this idea of what the future is, or quite simply, what is the future. And a lot of my anxiety stems from a potentially singular vision of what that future is, meaning a time ahead of us envisioned by a select few who are determining how life, politics, economics, etc., will be. And the lot like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, etc. So, how people will be governed in the future. Ultimately, that's something that I think about a fair bit for quite some time. And if anything, it just feels like this idea of this future increasingly for me sometimes it just feels like it is the present, like today, which is just like copy and pasted with little room for collective editing or change. And so this notion of polyphony comes from music, much like polyphonic music or polyphonic synthesizers. The idea of a future with multiple voices was sort of like an image and concept that I wanted to stick with and consider sort of like what would a future with multiple voices be like. A future where the multiplicity isn't concerned or bothered with a few filthy rich billionaires, but what is this paradigm where collective editing, not only agency but a kind of interdependence that is exercised at the interest of building, shaping and bridging communities and resources. That's sort of like what it what the impetus was like. And so for me, this premise of a polyphonic future is something I would like to look forward to, because at least there is an acknowledgement of time where multiplicity and diversity is part of the fabric that's being woven together. My interest in speculative future, where tying the development and use of technology with survival, is more about, and so this is, as my next slide would say, borrowing from what Clapperton Chakanetsa Mavunga has eloquently put it, it is about how to reimagine innovation in ways that are communal, not inclusive, which is a much abused word referencing the generative value of difference as afterthought. So my interest in polyphonic future resonates with this frame that he has offered. And so if we take off from that thought, reimagining innovation in ways that are communal, which pays special attention to differences as part of collective cohabitation. So I'd also like to supplement with two other quotes, and the first is from Singapore artist Ho Zun Yen, where he said, "Speech is a spell, and words, once ejected into the air, walk the weave of worlds." And the second is by Mauritian Alayari and Daniel Roque, where they wrote in their Editivist Manifesto, "Our technologies are the sex organs of material speculation. Any attempt to understand these occurrences is blocked by our own anthropomorphism. In order to proceed, therefore, one has to birth post-human machines, a phantasmagoric and unrepresentable repertoire of actual re-embodiments of the most hybrid kinds." Okay, next slide. So my interest with the future started from a silly realization. Sorry, I'm so sorry. From a silly realization specific to the Hollywood science fiction film The Day After Tomorrow. Uh, yeah, in the Malaysian screening of the film, the posters and the subtitles had translated this title to next slide, please. Translated to loser. This is not wrong at all. But there is an interesting thing that happens here, kind of flattening to the kind of suggested horror, right, that the English title had intended. Looser feels like it is just the day after tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow. And this dissonance is what fascinated me to how language plays a role in conveying and imagining time ahead. With Looser as a title, I somehow like don't think of global catastrophe. I think of making plans to visit my extended family. It's a different kind of horror, but a horror nevertheless. So this got me thinking also how in Malay there is no specific word for future. Next slide, please. And the person controlling the slide is Rafi. He's doing such an excellent job like putting all this together. Thank you so much, Rafi. So yeah, in Malay there is no specific word for future, but a phrase put together which is masa depan, which could mean time ahead or time to come. Yeah, so as the slide demonstrates, right, tomorrow in Malay would be besok or esok. Specific word for day after tomorrow is lusa, for instance. And so, yeah, going back to the phrase masa depan or time ahead suggests that there is in fact time ahead of us, right? If we think of this translation of time ahead, it is suggestive that there is in fact time ahead of us and that there is also time behind us, which is sort of like illustrative as time being something linear, if we take it from that point of view. But if we also consider time to come, right, like hadapan, something to come, it breaks this linearity because it gestures a time that hasn't yet arrived. But where it is coming from is unsaid. Uh, it is not determined if it is ahead, from above, so on and so forth. And so this fluidity, hang on, just get my slides. So this fluidity in the Malay language offers us to think about time, right? In this odd binary of being both linear and non-linear. For me, was what was exciting in utilizing language as a means of examining how navigating and orientating through time occurs. And not only that, the Malay language extends this fluidity into the subject of gender, right? Malay language is gender neutral in the sense that it doesn't use gender pronouns when referring to someone or even something. So, for instance, the word dia, right, dia, is used to refer to someone. So, you can think of it as a pronoun in that sense. And here we come into a different domain of inquiry, one centered on bias. And again, as I shared earlier about the film, one which is troublingly reductive. So for me, it feels like it's a kind of colonization which makes an appearance here in how language is subsumed into a kind of premise where a bias that's not present in the language is suddenly ascribed one. Next slide, please. And so here I am referring to Google Translate, an application meant for translating, different languages as a means of unpacking what I'm hoping to address here. So you can try this for yourself if you like. Using Google Translate, I type in the sentence, "Dia seorang juru rawat," of which Google's translation tells me, next slide, she is a nurse. Yet when I then type in the sentence, "Dia seorang doktor," Google's translation now says, next slide, he is a doctor. Now, this form of algorithmic bias, where despite gender being irrelevant in the way that Malay language is utilized through machine learning, the machine determines and assigns gendered roles for both of these occupations. Next slide, please. But the bigger question is, of course, who is teaching the machine? Who is in fact responsible for the way a machine learns? So you know how people say ghosts are scary and robots are scary. I was tweeting about this, and and how robots can take over the world. I've come to realize I'm not afraid of ghosts. I'm actually afraid of people more. And similarly, I'm also not afraid of machines or robots taking over the world. I'm afraid of people more. There are systems that we live in where bias is continuously being perpetuated and can be attributed to racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. The list goes on. And it's always a question of who owns the machine, who is controlling them, and who is in control. And clearly, this is a system that needs to be reconfigured, if not dismantled. Next slide, please. So in this example that I tried to make, it's a position that the complexities of the Malay language isn't bound to a singular sort of like monophonic premise. The relation time has with the future is both linear and non-linear, and within the language itself, it has a history of utilizing gender-neutral pronouns. So this notion of diversity, inclusivity, and differences are sort of already contained in the way that language is utilized or has been utilized within the Malay language itself. So Malay as sort of like a communal language which considers all participants is sort of like the premise that I'm getting at. And so to me, this idea of the future has always been present in the Malay language. And on that note, and referring back to what Zunyan had written and was quoted, I felt like maybe this was that opportunity to write a future. And so, next slide, please. And so then, I started to come up with these short stories or these prosaic pieces, which sort of like details different imagined communities, utilizing different strategies or innovation at the interest of overcoming certain challenges or the trouble, if we could borrow how Donna Haraway puts it. How imagined communities are looking into certain strategies at the interest of staying with the trouble. And so the first one is a, s- is a semi-reflective piece. The first one, the first of the series is on Jalan Tentram. Next slide, please. I wouldn't read the slide, of course. You could take your time to read it, which sort of like details an imagined community that lives in a block of flats, and they have managed to run electricity for the entire building by converting uh, digital noise, things which are deemed as noise or things which are deemed as waste, has been sort of like filtered and utilized to power an entire building. And I think something as simple as that was something that I was actually, I mean, the motivation was for that was also had a lot to do with the fact that sometimes you think about when your next paycheck is coming in and if you could actually pay your electricity bills. And through that, a lot of it, was also thinking what are some sort of like other means of addressing these gaps, right? Where other sort of like avenues aren't exactly made possible or available. How else would a community sort of like surface together and come up with these strategies or these implementations, and eventually sort of like move on together? And so in this particular community, it was a group of people who came together to sort of like work on both software and hardware, which actually allowed for the entire building to have electricity, basically. And so, next slide, please. In the second iteration of this particular set of speculative fiction, speculative future works, the next one is called McRitchie Treetops. This one in particular was a little bit different. As much as I had written a script for it, I had also imagined them in a sort of like more visualized form. And this was where this notion of cryptocartography sort of like came from. For this particular community, they live within McRitchie Treetops. In sort of like an abandoned housing project that took place and never really materialized. So they've sort of like moved into this space, into this particular housing project, and allowed for other communities to sort of like come in and live together with them. The only thing was that when they moved in, they realized that it's sort of like been overtaken by spiders. Next slide, please. Sorry. And so once it has been sort of like overtaken with spiders or by spiders, as opposed to chasing out spiders, they decided to live together with the spiders. And so in this particular work, I look at this group of people who sort of like develop mechanisms to communicate with spiders through sense of touch and also through sound. Uh, but one of the main feature of this was creating a kind of map which relied on scent, in the way that for someone to sort of like find where this project is, where this house is, you would need a scent map in order to navigate through the nature reserves. And so the particular image that you're looking at was one of the prints that was done. It's a satellite image of McRitchie Treetops with coordinates, with encrypted coordinates of what kind of smell you are expected to experience when you go through the trail. Next slide, please. And so for this particular work, it was really just me exploring a series of encryption methods, and it's sort of like what got me interested uh, into forms of encryption and cryptography in general. Like, what does it mean to not so much share information between two parties, but to safeguard information or to safeguard your premises, your spaces, your ideas, so on and so forth. So the use of encryption as a tool of moving together into the future was sort of like something that was pivotal and central uh, for me in the last 1.5 years. Sorry about me clearing my throat so frequently. Now, next slide, please. So these are just some of the images of the work that was presented back in 2019, which sort of like had all which were all pretty much like tied in and relevant to this particular narrative of someone going into this housing uh, area and meeting up with the team, so on and so forth. All of them sort of like centered around someone conducting research, wanting to get to know more about these communities that have been uh, living isolated in that sense. And then we come to the third iteration, which is actually Kampong Tenggelam. Next slide, please. So as much as I was responding to Pak Latif's map, sorry, as much as I was referencing Pak Latif's map, there was also this interest as to how, not so much how Pak Latif remembers the space, but how he's also sort of like distributing this distributing a rather clear image of what that time and space was for him, right? There were a lot of very specific information, details that were captured, which I felt, given that how much time has passed, how much he preserved these information and these details, for me was like, yeah, that was quite remarkable. So reflecting on that, I was also thinking about what other ways could that be sort of like embodied, or how could that actually be shared or stored for that matter. Next slide, please. And so with Kampong Tenggelam, the premise, as you sort of like travel around and uncover the various narratives, or rather the various section of the narrative inside this space, you'd come to learn that this is a community who've sort of like created a kind of virtual space where data is stored within their own bodies. So this particular work actually was also partly inspired by Choi Kafai's work on dance fiction, in this idea of storing choreography in the body. Now, I mean, that premise alone was actually quite exciting for me. It was something that uh, I really that really resonated, and something that I thought through a fair bit. And so through that work, I thought about what it meant to actually encrypt stories, narratives, details into the body as forms of choreography as well. And I think like there's a part of the story that sort of like hints or gestures at this particular reference, or this particular homage to Kafai's work. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, so these are just details of the map that you would see if you travel through on the desktop. I will go to the last next slide. And so this last one, which I'll touch very briefly on, is called Tengah, which is the fourth iteration that was quite recently produced as well. Next slide, please. So with Tengah, it involved going into the neighborhood of Tengah, which currently is still, I believe, still underway, where a group of people have learned how to install spirits into the machines, if that's one way of me putting it without revealing too much. And so in this process, I learn about sort of like digital talismans and what it means to have these sort of like objects for machines to hold on to, and what it means to cohabit with entities that we are not familiar with, so on and so forth. And so with this fourth iteration, it dealt with living with entities, with subjects, and with objects that we are not privy to or we do not know of, but how it is important for us to build some kind of kinship, some kind of bond together at the interest of sort of like, again, living together, cohabiting together. Next slide, please. I believe that's pretty much it for my presentation. I don't know what's next in terms of these futuring, these worldings, these imaginings, but thank you for tuning in, and I leave it to Bin for his presentation.
Hello. Let me just start my timer first in case I talk more than I should. So, yeah, first of all, thanks Bani for inviting me, and of course, thank you very much to the National Gallery team, Mariel, as well as Rafi, who is handling the AV side of today's talk. So, listening to Bani's presentation, it made me think that we really have quite a fair bit of things that we are both interested in. For example, this idea of technology and magic and the intersections of that. I'm also particularly interested in this idea of technomancy and the intersections of superstitions and technology and the future hybrid of these things. For Kampong Tenggelam, I will just kind of start from the end result and sort of just moving backwards. Like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't sure what to make out of that as well. But I began thinking about this idea of converting the area into some sort of data, in response to what Bani wrote, and this idea of the future. So I began thinking about treating them as a data set and using this point clouds aesthetics as a way to represent the buildings and the environment, and they are really, each of them are really just kind of a data where you have like XYZ and also the RGB values, and that was something that was interesting to me because it sort of reflects this idea of data, and it is also at the same time glitchy, and that sort of creates a very different impression of what the area is. And if you travel through the work, you get to see the area in many different ways. It is recognizable from far. You know that, okay, this is the mosque and this is the shop houses. But at the same time, it offers a very different way of experiencing this area where you can bash through buildings, you can see through them, and creating very different versions of that to the audience, which is at once foreign and distant, but at the same time having very personal memories about that. So for what I'm going to present next, I'm going to talk about my work in areas that are related to what we have done here, and they are broken up into three different areas, which is on the act of wandering, on the act of immersion, and on speculation. Right. So next, please. So Rafi, next. Thank you. Hey, sorry. Previous. Never mind, just stop here. So one of my earliest memories on this idea of wandering was actually during my school days, and I remember the first distinct memory I had with that was getting my first Discman, very old school media, kind of dead now, but it was exciting for me, just having this personal device that I can carry on. And I remember, the first time I just sat there and putting headphones on, it sort of transported me to somewhere else. I was physically there, but it brought me away to places that I was triggered through the songs, not necessarily by the lyrics, but it could also be emotional response to the music itself. And Michael Boo sums this up pretty nicely in his book Sounding Out the City, where he talks about how personal stereos are one way to deal with the mundane and repetitive conditions of the everyday. and it also injects a level of satisfaction which is otherwise unobtainable. So this enables, like for myself, it took me away from this everyday cycle of taking the bus and the very dreaded end goal of reaching the school gate, which I really dreaded at the time. And it also can be used as a form of conversational preserve. It serves as a kind of defense, basically, where you can pretend to be somewhere else and not engage in unwanted interactions with people. So this was a kind of wandering that was very I wouldn't say impressive, but that was memorable to me. And that was the first instance where I began thinking about this idea of wandering. And so this helped me to enjoy the act of traveling and walking with no particular goal in mind. And this became a sort of habit to simply enjoy walking and wandering and being in the place and in the moment and just enjoying the process, basically. So I think this idea of tuning into the physical environment allowed me to discover new things and new thoughts and new insights, which later informed my artistic practice. Next. So one of the earliest work that I did in school, back in school in LaSalle, was a work called Bright Noise, and you will see a kind of similarity in the next projects that I will be showing, where I am basically playing the act of a kind of explorer or wanderer and going around to explore places or collecting data. So with Bright Noise, I was at this point of time where it became really trendy to have media facades on buildings, which was often done in a pretty bad taste and not actually offering the kind of distance to appreciate whatever was being displayed on the screen. So, and at the same time, there was a lot of light pollution that was going on, I think. So I wanted to respond to that, and I created this work called Bright Noise. Can you go next and play the video? So this is basically an instrument that takes it's also a 360 camera, but very different from what I'm using for this project. It's a very DIY, low-tech kind of camera where you basically physically spin the camera with a model and collecting something like a scan of the environment. And this is then translated through the brightness of each pixel into a soundscape. So the work is about this translation from light to sound and collecting an archive of that. So I wrote a software to basically just like run through all these pixels to play back corresponding sounds or basically noise of the light level. Can we go next? And the next project I did was Flood Helmet, and this was I think one of the very beginnings of my interest in topics like climate change and sea level rise. So Flood Helmet was a wearable piece of work that allowed someone to wear this physically and wander around the Singapore landscape. So what this does is that it sort of detects your physical location through GPS and then sort of layering that position over the future predicted sea level rise. So at some point you will we will face a literal flooding of the helmet, which basically means that you're at a point which is below sea level, and the lower it is, the more water will flood in front, in your visor, in the helmet. And this project was sort of inspired by a conversation I had with a friend when I was in the army. And that conversation was about a news report that was playing on the TV where it was talking about sea level rise. And I was just casually telling my friend that, hey, this is like, really, really bad. And my friend said, like, it doesn't concern him, and even if it did happen, it would happen far away in the future, and which would not really impact his life. So that got me thinking about how this lack of immediacy was one of the very integral problem when talking about such issues. And in fact, it's only after almost 10 years that the government is really talking about strategies in dealing with predicted possible sea level rise. So I want to create something that sort of close the gaps between the now and the possible futures. Yeah. And next. And in the last of this series, I in 2015 I did a residency in Paris, and I wanted to. One of the things that I was most interested in while just like walking along the river was some of the resonant and acoustic spaces that were under the bridges. So there were a lot of bridges just connecting the two different banks together, and it created a very unique sonic environment. And I was interested how this would translate visually in the sculptural form. So I created this instrument that is basically like a icosahedron, and each of the points were microphones that captured a moment of the sonic soundscape from all different directions. Next, please. And they were then translated into a three-dimensional form using a custom software that I wrote. And where you see the spikes, they are basically sound amplitudes corresponding to the direction that it was located in. Next, please. Yeah, and then further translated into the final version, which were 3D printed and made into aluminum prints as well. So this was really an attempt to create sculptural forms of the unseen and sonic representations of spaces. Yeah, and all the three projects that I talk about were projects where I had no clear goal in mind. When I would just wander around and responding to the sound and sights that I saw. And also the process of collecting this data is also something that was almost unknown to me. I didn't really know what was going to be there. Almost like taking an analog photo where you don't really know what's going to turn out. But that was something really enjoyable to me. So I've always been working with this idea of collecting data in the city in various forms, which I guess informed my final iteration of what we did with Kampong Tenggelam. And next, so around 2011, I also started to question this idea of interactive art. I mean, I was in a course called Interactive Art in LaSalle, which no longer exists because nobody was interested in joining the course, sadly. But I was questioning this idea of interactive art because I was seeing a lot of artworks where people were swinging their arms crazily or dancing in front of the screen, and I wonder if that's really something I want to do or something that I would call art. And I began thinking about what was actually attractive to me with the idea of new media, and I came out with the conclusion that it was really the experience, the kind of immersion that you can create with new media. So I began to think about what about, what can I do with this? And I kept going back to the idea of nature, and this is something very personal to me because I really love spending time in nature. And um, in fact, when I was in the army, my favorite time was actually, walking around in the forest rather than, and people were complaining about it, but I actually kind of enjoyed that. So I began to wonder how we can reconnect and bridge some of these lost connections that humans and nature once had, and also to reevaluate and rebalance this power dynamics between the two. So I began to make immersive installations that reinterpreted some of these natural phenomenons or looking at issues surrounding that. Next. So one of my first projects dealing with that was a work called, sorry, this is the wrong title. It's called Coronado. It's not too far too near. Coronado was a work that I created in response to a night visit to the seaside in Coronado in San Diego, and it was a very different experience for me. Even though I came from Singapore, where we are always surrounded by the sea, but the experience there was very different because it was massive, and the scale of it was entirely different from what we have here. So that also created a very different soundscape, and because it was nighttime, my sensory was very much tuned into the sonic aura, and I was basically captured in this moment of a sublime moment where I was in awe of this environment, and I wanted to begin to capture this moment and recreate that into an installation. So can you play the video, Rafi? So in this work, I had a kinetic sculpture, and the sound produced by the ball bearings were captured and fed into another sound system, which created a sort of feedback loop of the soundscape. So there's this ongoing, endless streams of sound that was bouncing around the space, creating a spatial environment. Okay, can we go straight to the slide 15 on speculation? I think we're running out of time, so I just want to skip to the more important part. So with the last section of this presentation is relating to this idea of speculation. I think my work doesn't deal exclusively with speculation. Rather, it plays with this idea of what the future can be through very absurd ways of presenting certain issues or phenomenons. So next. So one of the works that I did was called The Face Daily, which was presented in 2014 and one Fringe Festival. And this work deals with one of the social phenomena that I observe at the point of time. Again, a lot of the works that I do is based on my personal experiences. And at that point, I realized that a lot of people were consuming news through social media, and there was very little questioning about the authenticity of that, and almost no efforts made to verify this news. And people were reading them very much like entertainment. And there was also this fact that people were reposting and at the same time adding comments to that. So it was in a way republishing and adding on your personal opinions, which would very much influence the people following you. And if you are someone who is popular or influential, that would very much affect the people reading that as well. So I have a quote here that by Jimmy Wales that pretty much sums this up. And he said that it isn't that reading is going out of style, quite the opposite. And it's not that people don't care about the quality, quite the opposite. The death of traditional print media has come about because people are demanding more information of better quality and faster. So this idea of being fast also creates a lot of problem, and one of the by effects is the lack of authenticity. So the work is basically a daily feed of what I have in my own Facebook post. So I would collect all these posts daily, and around 6, 7 a.m., I would generate a version of a newspaper, which I send to print every day. And the news are a mixture of actual news and fake news and sort of like tabloid news or just like nonsense that people post. So for example, in this next slide, in this slide, we see a news article about a giant sea creature washes ashore in the Santa Monica coastline, and it was an image of this giant squid, which is actually fake news. But there were a lot of people sharing and posting them around, which was purely for entertainment purposes. And next, please. And in the work, I also sort of just printed all these different posts and articles in a very long scroll of paper, and they would simply add up over time, which where I wanted to show the amount of news that are being generated daily from this and how much people are consuming through social media. Next. Yeah, and I had very interesting reactions to that, and some people were really angry about what I was printing, and they were questioning me why and how could I do things like that. And that was actually what I wanted to sort of show by printing things that people read online, and sort of superimposing the two together. Because when we print the same thing onto a paper traditional format, does that change the way that we expect the content quality to be? So it is interesting for me how people's reaction could change from the very same thing that they read on a daily basis. And finally, the last one. Next and next. So I want to end today's presentation with the latest work that I did. So I've always been interested in this idea of climate change and why it is so difficult to make important and effective actions towards that. And I realized that it was a very massive problem, and it was something that was very difficult to comprehend on many levels. And one of the reasons why is because of political and commercial interest and that which affects how policies and politics are being played out. So and I was also inspired by a news article that I saw online. Can you go next? Yeah. So I saw this on the World Economic Forum website where they talk about how people are wrapping glaciers in blankets to keep them from melting. My first reaction was that, this must be fake news. It's so nonsense, so nonsensical. But I read, I went to verify the news, and it was actually something that really happened. And the fact that it actually stopped the ice from melting up to 70%. Of course, this is a very stopgap measure, but this is the kind of measure that we have to take in order to stop this, where there could be much more effective ways to go about it. So I wanted to play with this idea of absurdity. So I created a work called Rescue Operations, where the work was driven by a fictional text generated by a machine learning algorithm, which was using the GPT-2 language model, which was created by OpenAI, by Tesla. No, not Tesla. It was by Elon Musk, an organization that was researching on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the algorithm basically throws out a chunk of text relating to climate change or the glaciers or Arctic, and some of them reads like real scientific journals, and some of them would be very nonsensical. So if we could go to the next slide and play.
Open up from its cold waters to cool down. This change in brainflow triggered by acceleration of atmospheric temperatures to about -226 south latitude, the most distant point from our sun. In 2012, when the scientists of the Scottish Pole arrived, the only thought floating around.
The ice sheet is a thin layer of ice that covers the entire planet. It is the largest of the ice sheets in the world. It is the largest of the ice sheets in the world. It is the largest of the ice sheets in the world. It is the largest of the ice sheets in the world.
So this was one of the very absurd moments.
While melt rates could have been as high as 77 degrees Fahrenheit, this low melting rate would have eroded by potentially significant thickness chunks of open ice. Well, if only we would have from single-person objects transported very close by, that would have accelerated the melting. If we did not even send small precision bolts in just that way, I am most surprised at how little still remains of time would have happened. More than 500,000 people later, in years, even several inches of narrow zoom was missing, risking the destruction of entire buildings. That first Wassine eruption is believed to have had just a few seconds under intense volcanic activity. Dr. Goodfellow is writing an article on this issue early next year, making reports on the evidence.
Yeah, so the work really layers very different things together, where we have footages of real glaciers and ice sheets, and then we have the text which was being read by also machine learning softwares, reading machine generated text. And also another kinetic sculpture that was not shown is kind of an ice blanket that was used to reflect some of this heat. So it's something that superimposes very different things together and creating this very absurd situation where it borders between truth and non-truth, and really challenging the audience to make sense of what's going on in this work. Yeah. So I end my presentation with this, and we will, maybe take some Q&A questions now.
Okay, thanks both Bani and Bin for your presentations. It's not great to start a Q&A with, we only have so much time left, but we really do, we are a little bit out of time. So yeah, I think we'll just go through some of the questions that are asked by some of our audiences on Facebook. So I think, yeah, one of it, just going back to the idea of wondering for Bin, because you mentioned that, sometimes you wonder with no clear project in mind and you just respond to what you see and what you hear. And in a way, yeah, it's so nice that the methodology is so open and not so fixated upon outcome, but yeah, there is a kind of a rhythm and an openness to it. And yeah, so one of our questions is regarding wondering in relation also to the process of creating Kampong Tenggelam. And this, let's see. Yeah, so Royan asks, what was the process of creating Latif's map like? Did it involve going down on site to shoot the spaces, to document it? And yeah, what were your personal encounters with it? Was it the sense of decryption and encryption for you on a personal level?
Uh, so maybe I could start off with at least the sonic aspect of it. Field recordings isn't something that I do a lot of, but when I do get the chance, it's it's nice to do field work that way. To be out listening, and sort of like the real work sort of like comes in when you come back home, and then you realize details that you missed out when you were out on field recording. This time around, though, Kampong Glam, Arab Street area is sort of a place that I would say I'm fairly familiar with, or that I have a kind of history to the space, to the place in general, from very young up until this period where Aliwal Art Center is a place that I sort of like go to quite frequently. At one point in time, returning back there for field recording was quite an experience. It was like for the first time in probably many years. It was just very quiet. That there was not much human activity. That's one way of putting it. Although on the flip side to all this was that I felt like there was a surge of in soundscape ecology it's called biophony, which is sounds that's produced by other like animals, insects, so on and so forth. There was definitely a rise in that, or at least that was a lot more pronounced when I was on site. And returning back, when I'm reviewing the sounds as well, it's actually a very prominent thing to experience. So in the terrain that you explore on the map, I think that's something that is probably quite distinct. Which probably right now, if you go back, it might not be the same anymore. So at least that was one of the first immediate things that struck me returning back, in both during times of lockdown and otherwise.
Mm. Yeah, I think I have similar experiences. But I guess what's different for me is that I was dealing with something that was quite different. I mean, normally we'll use a video camera or a camera where we have a very fixed frame of reference of what we might possibly be taking. But I was using like this new fancy 360 camera, and I was just like, I wasn't sure what's going inside. So this plays into this idea of openness and losing control. I think I talked about this with the curators before, and um, I think in this work, one thing I also learned is that making something like this where everything is open was somewhat liberating, but also foreign to me, where I don't exactly know what will happen. Although I did specify at which point would this soundscape by Bani would be playing, I don't exactly know when or where they would come into my headphones as I travel through these things. So when I was sort of plotting and um, recreating the environment, I began to just become also very comfortable with working in this open concept environment in the virtual reality. And this is also one of my first virtual or purely digital work. So it was a very much a new experience for me, and also a kind of adventure, and just going down to some of these places where it was at once foreign and intimate, in the sense like I had very personal experiences there, but as I was doing this project, I was also experiencing the area in a very different way, with many different layers of remembering and also taking in new things at the same time. Yeah.
So I think related to the kind of how the project is tied to the physical space, I think there are two questions that are related to, I guess, the selection of areas. So I think one is for Bani, how you go about identifying the sites like MacRitchie, and also, moving forward, are you both keen to also look at other areas?
So I think exploring other areas is, at least for me right now, I wouldn't say it's, I'm constantly looking at different spaces as a means of sort of like understanding what are some unique attributes, if anything else. Like, you know, the whole part of my series in terms of MacRitchie, Jalan Tentram. I mean, yeah, these are sort of like spaces that I visit. I kind of like sit in or wander a fair amount of spend a bit of time within these spaces and sort of like trying to find what are some of the sort of like not so much interesting characteristics, but maybe sometimes what are the things that's absent as well, and in that process what could then come into play, what could then sort of like emerge from this absence as well. So as much as yeah, I mean, I would definitely, it's definitely something that's ongoing in terms of not so much looking, but sitting in these spaces and sort of like absorbing these different places. It's definitely something that is sort of like ongoing, at least for this work that's pegged to isolated futures. How do I go about identifying these sites? Yeah, so usually there would be a characteristic from these spaces that really intrigues me. Like, for instance, for Jalan Tentram, for instance, that's actually kind of like where I live, right? Which explains why it's the first place that I wrote. Um, some of the units that's in a separate estate from where I stay, the kind of, how do I pronounce this? The maison scène, or you know, this kind of like
Maison Sen.
the way, yeah, maison scène. The way that, you know, it's sort of like
Whatever.
set up sometimes feels like there's a story that's waiting to be told. In my opinion, you know, there's like a lot of very interesting sort of like features, fixtures, and also sort of like implementations, which have so much sort of like either histories that's unspoken of or unsaid, and the way that things are sort of like put together sometimes just feel like it makes me feel like, you know, as an assemblage, was there like an intention, or was there a very specific way that these sort of like things are put together. So I mean, it really just comes from a place where I'm not so much curious about what these things are, but what they could also represent or what they also mean. And so usually it's identifying or observing something which is quite, not, I wouldn't say unique, but something that is wanting to speak but has not had the chance to speak yet. And I'm just going through this process of speculating on what it would say if I had a chance to speak to it.
Okay, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So I think this one is a little bit more technical, but I think it's quite interesting on how, for you both, Bunny and Bin, how you decided on the scale and distance, the magnitudes in the virtual work.
Yeah, Bin, do you want to take this first? Hi.
Yeah, I'm Debbie. Debbie. That was one of the challenges that we face initially. Like, how do we go about doing this? And I started off, obviously with the map, and I soon realized that the sense of distance and scale was something that was very malleable, or was fluid. And even though um, the the ratios of the buildings are somewhat similar to the actual buildings, but a lot of it was very exaggerated through the use of the camera viewports. And I think for me, that was something that I purposely created to create this sort of collapsing of um, references to the real space, and that was intentional, and also because I wanted to create this very sort of glitchy, very fragmented environment where it is both recognizable and something very foreign. Yeah. So I think that was my strategy towards that. And Bani also has something to add on to that.
Mm. For sound and spatialization, I think that's something that was quite new for me in this particular project. I've never worked with like 360 sound or 3D audio, so this was a really like great learning experience for me. So to respond to your question, when I was in the first round, when I went for field recordings, after I came back and listened to them, I realized that the way that a 360 recording device works offers a what is the term for it? I mean, there's a unique augmenting in the way that I experience the space in general. As much as I
Mm.
think that was what it sounded like, I'm pretty sure. I mean, and when I returned back, and collected similar time, yeah, during a similar time as well, like 4 p.m. Kind of time period, I realized that being there is certain exaggeration, if that's one way of putting it, like three, maybe because I'm so used to like how we're listening through stereo, for instance, but 360 sound felt like there was this very strange exaggeration as to how you're sort of like uh encapsulated in this. And so if anything else, when we were designing it, I think one of the challenges was also about how perceptible these mixes were. And so I think we had to bring the level up a little bit at the interest of sort of like making the space feel a little bit bigger as well. But in relation to the way that I was writing Kampong Tenggelam, for instance, putting aside Pak Latif's map and also the actual space, I think this idea of, I mean, Tenggelam refers to something that's sort of like uh, sinking or that has sunk, right? And so I think that idea of something that is not so much at a distance, but something that is hidden behind something, and you're sort of like trying to move within this particular space, was the kind of space that I was sort of like imagining or had envisioned. So the way that the audio was then treated, there was like a strange sort of like reverb and shaping or contouring the kind of environment at the interest of wanting it to feel like you're inside a really big space, but you're just compressed down. At least sonically, that was kind of like how I was imagining the sound to feel or for one to encounter the space.
Mm.
I think, yeah, so related to that question, yeah, I think there is this other one also on, and I think this also relates to how both of you as artists, I mean, for your own research, like your own practice, how you convert one data to another. But I think the second is how you both collaborated in this process. Because Bani, I understand you did most of the research, the writing, as well as the sound, collecting the sounds, whereas Bin, you're the one that created this like visual skit, right? So yeah, I mean, the final piece, it looks so seamless, and like the layering. So we're just yeah, share a bit more about how you decided to map them and how you work together to in this process.
Mm. Okay, so I can try to take this one first. Hi, Javon.
Mm.
So for the question that you pose on converting data from one form medium to another, how do we identify which data parameters to privilege and how to map them to correspond to a visual or sonic output? So I guess at least for the works that I was sharing in particular, at least with the isolated feature series, data as a subject or as a topic is something on the periphery, I suppose. I can't say that it's something that is an undercurrent. And particularly with Kampong Tenggelam as well, maybe it's probably the only work that sort of like deals with how or what it means to store data and encrypt data as well. And so in this instance, it was sort of like, uh, particularly if I go back to your point number one, this notion of who has access or who has privilege to this data was something where the community has sort of like decided that these information or these data sets belong to the community itself, right? That it is something that uh, that data is not viewed as a commodity, that it is something that belongs, that is inherent to the people that has it, or that is producing it,
Mm,
for that matter. So that's one way that data at least is addressed. Is there a lag?
a bit.
Oops.